Are the ancient prophecies found in many ancient cultures and religions becoming truth? It seems the world's leaders, mainly the leaders of the West, is driving us toward making the prophecies come true. Just look at the climate and possibility of World War III.
Which warns, when the gourd of ashes drops, you will know the end of the world is near. The Hopi elders believed the atom bomb to be that very gourd of ashes, for in 1948 they held a tribunal, appointing a guardian of their prophecies. Prophecies set in stone by distant ancestors and covered with the dust of time. The man chosen? Thomas Banyanka.
It's been here for a long time. They knew about destroying, but no one knew it was here.
Thomas Banyanka is the keeper of the carvings. It was he who uncovered the prophecies etched in stone after they lay hidden for many years.
So I wrapped this. So I was the one that cleaned this mess up and showed a drawing, and I was so surprised.
Thomas Banyanka is one of several Hopi elders who is entrusted with the pre-Columbian prophecy that has a series of final warnings to be told to the world before what is called the Great Purification by Fire. Either it can be a fire of nuclear war and greenhouse global warming, or it can be a fire of inner consciousness.
In the Four Corners region of Arizona, the ancient Hopi Prophecy rock looms, chronicling the destiny of mankind in Hopi hieroglyphics, leading towards what some fear is inevitable extinction.
This figure represents the Great Spirit or guardian of this land that we came on this earth, what we call now the Mother Earth.
In the first figure carved by the Hopi ancients, the Great Spirit or Creator meets man. The Creator then gave man the sacred circle, a promised life of peace and plenty if, and only if, man would follow the spiritual path. While the brown man waited, the white man traveled the earth on a mission to spread the spiritual circle and return with knowledge.
He was supposed to bring this, but instead he brought a symbol of a cross, they said. It's on here, cross.
Breaking away from the Native American people, the white man now traveled the path of materialism and invention, as shown by these three figures on the Rock of Prophecy.
I always say that first figure represents first invention like wagon pulled by animals. And later the second one representing advancements in inventions. He brought automobiles that run by itself. Then the third one represents also advancements in inventions, scientific things, and now they have rode up in the sky.
With the invention of the aeroplane, the white man now commanded the land, sea, and sky. And just as the Hopi Prophecy rock appears to predict, this thirst for power led to two devastating events, World War I and World War II.
There's a line down over here, and that's where we are today. And the zigzag light represents up there big nations. Powerful nations put their military might together and kill thousands of women, children, animals, birds. We have now come into last little circle above the line, which is, they said, maybe the beginning of Third World War.
And so, as the Hopi Prophecy goes, we find ourselves at the crossroads with the fate of the entire race of man hanging on one all-important question. Do we return to the sacred circle and the life of harmony and abundance? Or do we take the jagged road, leading us further and further from the spiritual path?
If that happens, according to Hopi Prophecy, the purification by fire will immediately commence.
These chilling words place us precariously close to the edge. Will civilization end in a holocaust of flame?
They're not going to save the world. They're not going to bring peace and justice. They're going to destroy the world. That's what old people say. So it'll just end with gourd full of ashes. The whole world, all living things will be destroyed. there'll be nothing left on this earth. Everything will burn up.
Logic, reason, just plain common sense, all argue that seeing into the future is impossible.
You're gonna hear the declaration. Don't respect my tribal nation. Get blown back by revelation. Got to teach the second generation. My mystery, no question about future history. Ain't no question about my thoughts and all the vivid imagery. And it's the sea to seas, glaciers melt into the sea. Turtle Island changing shape so drastically. All the cries and pleas from heat and sizzling degrees. Made worse because the earth erupts volcanically. Then the fires burn, scorch, black, green topography. People perish, not immune to all the new disease. And it's the war talk out the mouths of warlocks. Got them trying to buy peace after war's fought. And for the first time, America's the battleground. That's how my weapons make them skyscrapers rattle down. Yeah, there's no lights or grocery stores for your food. Just a mass exodus of cities and their hoods. From prophetic declarations given from the north. And it fulfills the dreams of chief, awful-looking horse. Let's go! Can't walk a mile in my shoes. You're gonna hear my points of views. Don't give a damn about the truth. Love to sing the same blues. You're gonna hear the declaration. Don't respect my tribal nation. Get blown back by revelation. Got to teach the second generations.
While it does seem like the world's nations, mainly the West and East, is pushing the world toward the point of no return, involving climate change and World War III. But it's never too late for the world's leaders and society to make change. The prophecies such as the Hopi Prophecy rock can be viewed as warnings to humanity. We as humans have basically two paths to choose from. Do we choose the path of greed, overconsumption, and war? Or do we choose the path of higher consciousness and living in harmony with the environment and having tolerance with all our neighbors?
Maybe it's about time we, as a collective human race, should start tackling the issues of climate change and the possibility of World War III. Many indigenous people across the world are doing their part. They are the world's most aggressive protesters against man-made climate change. From the Sami peoples of Europe to the Inca descendants of the Andes and to the native Pacific Islanders, all have been encouraging world leaders at the United Nations Climate Change Conference to take action.
Whether from Ecuador, Chile, or Canada, Indigenous people here at COP26 say they are united in the ways their communities are being devastated by climate change, and they want the world to know.
All of these Indigenous people who have come here for the same reason. Their lands are going. Their people are sick. They have no food.
Groups like Indigenous Climate Action, based in Edmonton, say if governments and businesses partnered with them, they could help achieve the goals of COP26. Carbon markets and offsetting, they say, do not serve as real solutions.
In reality, they're not actually reducing emissions. They're just kind of putting a blanket over what's actually happening.
Canada is championing the idea of putting a global price on carbon. It is a big part of our national strategy and one more countries could adopt by the end of the summit.
Carbon pricing is one of the most effective and cheapest ways to get there.
But not everyone supports it.
It's a false solution. Anything carbon-based is false because it commodifies nature and the land.
Wanting to hammer that message home, Indigenous groups planned a rally outside of a carbon market discussion Wednesday. However, Greta Thunberg ended up being a part of that session, and given all of this security, they decided it was too risky and called it off. She too has been a vocal opponent of carbon pricing, saying it doesn't address root causes or force polluters to change their behaviors. Valerie Courtois is the director of the Canadian Indigenous Leadership Initiative. She says right now the world needs more collaboration.
This movement of Indigenous-led conservation and stewardship is absolutely a response to the threat that is coming and looming on us, that is climate change and biodiversity loss.
On October 15, 2012, Evo Morales signed the Law of Mother Earth, developed by social organizations to serve and protect the nation's natural resources. The law defines Pachamama as the dynamic living system formed by the indivisible community of all life systems and living beings which are interrelated, interdependent, and complementary, and which share a common destiny. The law enumerates 5 specific rights to which Mother Earth and her constituent life systems, including human communities, are entitled to, including the right to live, understood as the maintenance of life systems and natural process which sustain them, as well as the capacities and conditions for their renewal. That the right to diversity, understood as the preservation of the variety of beings that comprise Mother Earth, without being genetically altered or artificially modified in their structure in such a manner that threatens their existence, functioning, and future potential. The right to water, understood as the preservation of the quality and composition of water to sustain life systems and their protection with regards to contamination. The right to clean air, understood as the preservation of the quality and composition of air to sustain life systems and their protection with regards to contamination. And the right to equilibrium, understood as the maintenance or restoration of the functionality of Mother Earth in a balanced manner for the continuation of its cycles and the renewal of its vital processes.
Resolution 1129, the gentlewoman from New Mexico, Ms. Holland, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from New Mexico.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to offer this amendment with my co-sponsors, Representatives Talib and Ocasio-Cortez, in order to speed us along the path to a renewable energy future. Our amendment increases the authorization levels for the solar, wind, geothermal, and water-based energy research and development programs by 50% over the levels currently in the bill for each of the 5 years the bill covers. The amendment also adds an overall authorization level for research, development, deployment, and commercial application activities within DOE's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. For each of the 5 years in the bill, those authorization levels are 110% of the funding levels for the carbon pollution reduction R&D activities in the bill. Technological innovation has long been seen as an important part of our efforts to take on climate change, increase access to energy, and reduce air pollution. Increasing the efficiency of solar cells of wind turbines, developing new marine hydrokinetic generation technologies and lighter electric motors, and improving the storage capacity and lifetime of batteries are just some of the innovations that will help us get to a 100% clean energy system. But according to the International Energy Agency's Global Status of Clean Energy Innovation Report for 2020, research and development spending on clean energy by its member countries has been relatively flat since 2012. After a doubling spurt between 2000 and 2012, despite that doubling, IEA member country public spending on R&D remains below the levels it was in the 1980s. Private sector spending has fluctuated with economic cycles. While there have been some growth years, the 2007-08 financial crisis and the 2014 oil price crash led to slowdowns in corporate clean energy and R&D, and the share of global early-stage venture capital investment going into clean energy has halved since 2012. And now, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a dramatic negative impact on private sector funding for clean energy innovation, which is likely to cause setbacks in the timeline for developing and improving clean energy technologies. The pandemic will also hurt demonstration projects and early adoption of technologies that provide essential opportunities for us to learn by doing and figure out how to overcome practical obstacles to widespread deployment of new technologies. The timing is extremely unfortunate because, as the IEA report makes clear, we need to be accelerating clean energy innovation to give the world the best chance to achieve our climate goals, and without strong, sustained investment, our chances of success are dwindling.
Winona LaDuke, my friend, has made these connections in the past, but we have to think about these pipeline struggles in a global geopolitical context, as well as understanding that these pipelines are transporting oil oftentimes to a global market, and therefore they're transnational projects as well. And they're not just affecting the indigenous communities of where they're being built, but they're also affecting people throughout the globe.
But what about this ongoing resistance to pipelines throughout the United States and Canada? I want to go to President Trump right after he was inaugurated, announcing the pair of presidential memorandums to revive the Keystone XL and Dakota Access Oil pipelines, the two major projects halted by the Obama administration following massive resistance from indigenous and environmental groups.
This is with regard to the construction of the Keystone Pipeline, something that's been in dispute, and it's subject to a renegotiation of terms by us. We're going to renegotiate some of the terms, and if they'd like, we'll see if we can get that pipeline built. A lot of jobs, 28,000 jobs, great construction jobs. This is with respect to the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. Dakota Access Pipeline. Again, subject to terms and conditions to be negotiated by us.
So that is President Trump, newly inaugurated, announcing that he was moving forward with the Dakota Access Pipeline and he was reviving the Keystone XL. The significance of this, Professor Estes.
So if we go back to 2014, Obama was the one of 6 sitting presidents to actually visit an Indian reservation during his time in office, and he actually visited Standing Rock during their Flag Day powwow and met with then tribal chairman Dave Archambault III. And so he made a promise to youth at that particular powwow that he would, that we would put our minds together to make what's best for the future generations, citing Sitting Bull, one of the Lakota leaders of resistance in the 19th century. And, that the Dakota Access Pipeline, when it came, down from the Bakken oil region, it was those Standing Rock youth who ran to Washington, D.C., hoping that Obama would live up to his promise to listen to the youth, the indigenous youth. From what we know now, it's that we don't know if he was even listening. And so in many ways, Obama couldn't really halt the construction of the pipeline. Towards the end of his term, I know that there was an order to halt the construction and a mandated environmental review. But by and large, his administration was a failure to uphold sort of that promise to indigenous people. And so if Obama's administration is a failure, then the Trump administration is an absolute catastrophe for indigenous nations in the United States, because Trump has intensified the oil and gas extraction, not just in the Bakken region, but here in the Four Corners area, in the Permian Basin, in western Texas, and parts of New Mexico. Oil production has just, increased, and he's using the Bureau of Land Management to essentially sell off, sometimes for dollars on the acre, indigenous land, or public lands as we know it now, which is really just stolen indigenous land, to the highest bidder. And when we talk about pipelines, right, and we talk about oil and gas production, we really have to talk about the source of those pipelines. And here, in the Southwest region, it's the Permian Basin and the Four Corners region, where there's been extensive fracking and oil and gas development. But also, what's happening now with the Keystone XL pipeline is very interesting. I'm from South Dakota, originally born and raised, and the governor of South Dakota introduced Kristi Noem introduced a series of anti-protest legislation bills specifically targeting water protectors in South Dakota who may be protesting the Keystone XL pipeline. And the interesting thing about that, and we can go back to the Standing Rock protest, is that these states, have contentious relations with tribal nations to begin with, right? We didn't sign treaties with the state governments, but yet the state governments participate in the continued criminalization of Indigenous people for trying to uphold our treaty rights. And so why are we criminals, and activists who are just trying to protect, land and water? And when we go back to the treaties, in like the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty, which the Keystone XL pipeline contravenes and trespasses through treaty-protected territory of the Great Sioux Reservation, we're not asking the state of South Dakota to do anything radical. We're not asking non-Indigenous people to do anything radical. All we're asking them to do is to uphold their own constitution. Your government signed the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty with us. It's your responsibility to uphold that treaty as well. And your own constitution says that treaties are the supreme law of the land. And what we're finding out with a lot of these ranchers and white communities is that they have no say over the construction of these pipelines. They have no say of whether or not they're going to be built on their land, because TransCanada is using state governments to condemn property and to create rights of way through their land. And so now they're turning to Indigenous communities, and they're turning to treaty rights and understanding that it's treaty rights, and specifically Indigenous rights, that really protect everyone's rights when it comes to environmental justice issues. And so while there is this kind of adverse effect of the continued criminalization of water protectors, whether it's in Louisiana, whether it's in North Dakota, or even in Canada with the eviction of the Unistoten resistance camp in Wet'suwet'en territory, or whether it's in South Dakota and the criminalization of water protectors there, we can understand that there's also a growing alliance with non-Indigenous communities who are seeing value in Indigenous rights and specifically treaty rights. And to me, that is the most hopeful sort of sign of this current resistance movement, is that Indigenous rights are at the forefront because they protect everybody's rights.
You say the Green New Deal really was born out of the standoff at Standing Rock. Explain.
So Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, before she became a congresswoman, she was also a water protector. She was at Standing Rock, and she's even said this in her interviews, where she began her campaign in the resistance camps and the prayer camps at Standing Rock, and specifically Ocheti Shalkowi camp. And so when people are asking, where's the inspiration of the Green New Deal, we can really locate it at Standing Rock. Where you had sort of the transition from one administration, the Obama administration, to the Trump administration. And I believe Ocasio-Cortez was at Standing Rock after November 8th, 2016, when the election of Trump really caught a lot of people by surprise. And the irony of that was, there was a massive resistance movement against the construction and the expansion of carbon infrastructure led by Indigenous people at Standing Rock. But in reality, that pipeline was an extension of Obama-era energy policies. And so if we go back to 2007 and 2008 and look at the North American oil boom, that really happened around the time of the Great Recession. And so in many ways, the United States, along with countries like Canada, drilled their way out of the Great Recession largely at the expense of Indigenous lands. And what I mean by that is, if we look at the oil sands in Alberta, Canada, and we think about the Dakota Access Pipeline, which Indigenous people, my people, the Lakota people, call the Black Snake, the Alberta tar sands is really the snake pit, where a lot of these oil pipelines are snaking out across the country, and specifically traversing and trespassing through Indigenous communities and putting them at risk. And so when we think about things such as the Green New Deal and their impact on Indigenous communities, we have to remember that the inspiration for that, and really the frontline communities that inspired this, were communities like Standing Rock and indigenous communities, not just in the United States, but throughout North America, or what we call Turtle Island. And so when we talk about what's happening, the flooding, the massive flooding that's happening in places like southeastern Africa, we can connect it to the oil production in the United States and in North America in general, because the United States has now surpassed countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia when it comes to oil production. And we can look at places like the Bakken oil region where the Dakota Access Pipeline was originating from, as sort of being ground zero for this this new sort of climate deal that needs to take place because it affects indigenous communities first and foremost.
Last week, a Louisiana pipeline spilled 672,000 gallons of crude oil into the Gulf of Mexico. Meanwhile, an oil barge carrying 133,000 barrels of oil exploded off the coast of Texas, leaving 1 worker dead and 2 missing. Millions of Americans are still recovering from the recent hurricanes that devastated communities all across Texas, Louisiana, Florida, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, and the deadly wildfires in California. Now, despite these environmental crises, EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt continues to make backroom deals with fossil fuel industry giants at the expense of our environment and the well-being of the American people. That's why I'm working to pass my bill, the Off Fossil Fuels for a Better Future Act, which would transition our country away from fossil fuel sources to 100% renewable energy by 2035. To begin to heal our planet and strengthen our future, we must break our addiction to fossil fuels by investing in clean energy. Passing my bill, the OFF Act, will also increase our country's global competitiveness by creating domestic clean energy technologies, jobs, and training programs. Now, earlier today, I was joined by 2 of my colleagues, Barbara Lee and Annette Diaz-Barragan, as well as leaders from organizations like Food and Water Watch, National Nurses United, Casa Pueblo, and other local officials and grassroots organizers, as we all gathered to urge Congress to pass the Off Fossil Fuels Act. Now I'm asking you, join us in this critical fight by signing on as a citizen co-sponsor at votetulsi.com/offact. We must take action. Our planet, our people, and our future depend on it.
Indigenous leaders and scientists in North America and Bolivia are offering solutions to climate change. They are developing new green electric grids, green energy production, and new green technologies. They want to offer their green energy production to the world and their regions.
My name is Melina Lebocan Massimo, the host of Power to the People, a new documentary series that discovers how Indigenous peoples, values, and wisdom are leading the world towards a clean energy future.
This is what an 80-panel top-of-mount system solar project looks like. Energy transition, self-determination, food security, and what autonomous decision-making looks like. This project was a project that came from a community because we're completely surrounded by fossil fuel extraction. But that's not something that we necessarily wanted. It was a foreign imposition. So Pitapan signifies a changing, a coming of a dawn back to empowering our people.
I think we've got to think much more about our food, where it comes from, and thank Mother Earth for her generosity.
Thank the salmon and save the salmon.
Yes, exactly.
I'm really excited to go to other communities that have started doing this as well, whether it be solar, wind, geothermal exchange. I think there's a multitude of renewable energy systems that I have yet to learn about.
This is part of the Grand Renewable Energy Park, which is 249 megawatts. So this farm is 100 megawatts, where this wind you see behind is 149 megawatts.
We see this is like really the energy transition that we're all really hoping for.
These here are linden trees, and they're actually one of the few trees that we can eat the leaves.
This knowledge is actually going to help us survive the era of climate change. So the time is now to continue to learn your traditions, learn your culture, learn how to incorporate new technology, but also teach others and take action. I'm excited to embark on this journey and bring everyone along with me.
We broke ground on this project in early 2014. Just 2.5 years later, construction is complete, and the plant is delivering now 250 megawatt of power to Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, providing enough clean energy to power approximately 111,000 homes. This clean renewable solar power is displacing approximately 341,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide annually, which is equivalent of taking about 73,000 cars off the road. This facility has 3.2 million First Solar PV modules, which equates to more than 25 million square feet of solar panels. That's enough glass to cover more than 450 NFL football fields.
I'm honored and pleasured to represent my tribe. This is something, I'll never forget. It's an historical event for us. For Southern Paiute Nation, it's been 7 years for us to get this far, and for us to start developing and turning on this solar project. We had 150 plus Native Americans here, and we had roughly about 55 tribal members working out here.
And we were having a conversation earlier. I think that's the biggest switch we have ever seen. And it would be nice if we had a switch like that. We can turn Congress on and off when we didn't like what they had to say.
Set, go.
This is a project to transform the economy of our First Nation. There's 87 turbines. The critical number, though, is the size. It's a 300 megawatt project. Around 100,000 homes are powered from the output from this project. And most of our power goes straight south through Parry Sound, through Barrie to Toronto. So we're the only green energy project that's actually feeding metropolitan Toronto. The impact job-wise is greater than we imagined. We don't have a group of shareholders looking for the best return on their investment. We have a community of almost 900 people wanting to be equal. We want parity with Canada. The standards of living, again, we're seeking parity, and I hope that we don't miss the boat on that.
Y la electromovilidad es una de las alternativas precisamente para enfrentar los efectos que las emisiones de los combustibles fósiles han provocado. Su uso va en aumento y esta semana Bolivia presentó su primer auto eléctrico 100% boliviano. Aquí le contamos cómo es este auto.
La contaminación de nuestro planeta ha llegado a niveles alarmantes. El aire que respiramos hace daño, pero gran parte de la contaminación ambiental tiene relación con cómo nos desplazamos. Y la mayoría de los datos apuntan a los autos como los principales causantes del smog. Pero ¿cuál sería la solución al problema automotriz? Los autos eléctricos parecen ser la respuesta y Bolivia ya apuesta por ellos. El país vecino tiene grandes reservas de litio, un material que es ocupado para armar baterías y al mismo tiempo generar electromovilidad, un negocio rentable del que Bolivia ya forma parte con su primer auto eléctrico 100% boliviano. Este es el Quantum, la creación de industrias Quantum Motors. 2 modelos que cuentan con capacidad para 3 personas, alcanzan hasta los 60 kilómetros por hora y su batería dura unos 70 kilómetros. Se demoran entre 6 y 7 horas en cargar y su precio ronda los 3.400.000 y los 3.800.000 pesos. El Quantum es considerado como económico y amigable con el medio ambiente, características que concuerdan con el compromiso sobre el cambio climático que el presidente Evo Morales insistió en tener en la cumbre climática de la ONU.
Bolivia está comprometida con los derechos de nuestra madre tierra, con la lucha contra el cambio climático. Todavía estamos a tiempo de salvar a la madre tierra, pero debemos actuar ahora, con acciones urgentes y concretas que permitan la preservación de la vida.
Just below the surface of Bolivia's vast salt flats may lie the key to the electric car's future. At these evaporation pools, workers extract lithium, a soft metal that's a vital component in rechargeable batteries. Uyuni has about 70% of the world's supply, or enough to power 5 billion vehicles. It's a windfall that could dramatically change the course of South America's poorest economy.
President Morales' vision for the state to industrialize lithium extraction at Uyuni salt flats involves all Bolivians. This is actually becoming a new pillar of economic development here.
This lithium gold mine has transformed Little Bolivia into a potential power broker in the world's race for alternative fuels. Technicians are hard at work inside a government-financed factory, trying to produce a commercial-ready form of the mineral.
Our goal at the laboratory is to take each sample and determine the amount of ions. That's to say, how much lithium, potassium, sodium, and calcium is present.
Bolivia has so far refused help from foreign partners to bring its lithium production online. President Morales aims to keep a tight national grip on the industry.
From the lab to the lumberyard, University of Washington researchers are helping make fuel out of forest waste.
We call our program Bioresource-Based Energy for Sustainable Societies.
Through a grant from the National Science Foundation, doctoral students in engineering and forest resources partner with Native American tribes, developing use of sustainable resources for energy production. Steve Rigdon is both a student in the program and a manager at Yakima Power, a Yakima Nation utility.
The Yakima Nation through Yakima Power are looking at opportunities to use egg waste, mill waste, forest waste as a renewable energy source for biofuels.
Sawdust and other wood waste can be burned to produce energy, replacing some of the fossil fuels used to run the mill. Elsewhere, agricultural and forest waste can be ground up for fuel as well. Benefits for tribes include new jobs and revenue from selling power, a cleaner environment through replacing fossil fuels, and support for forest restoration with fewer uncontrolled forest fires as logging debris is removed.
We always are looking for the triple bottom line, which is the environmental impacts, the societal impacts, and the economic impacts of our work.
Societal impacts involve the mark that renewable energy options leave on the landscape. For example, Yakima Power is building a wind turbine demonstration site so the tribe can assess both the aesthetic and cultural effects. And the University of Washington is there to help with all the options.
The students are working with absolutely the best facilities and equipment and faculty to answer really important, far-reaching questions.
It's creating a sustainable energy option with the existing infrastructure, the multi-resource ecosystem services that the Yakima Nation and our neighbors really want to see coming out of their forests.
Of the 10 poorest counties in the United States, more than half fall on Native American tribal lands in North and South Dakota. But these Great Plains reservations, once thought valueless, are the Saudi Arabia of reliable wind energy, an untapped resource that can power the country while empowering the people. The tribes know the value of the wind and are uniting as never before to build the largest utility-grade wind installation in the U.S. Americans want renewable energy, but it's a tricky business. Wind energy takes a big investment to build and more to distribute to the people who want it. Traditional financing methods are too costly. Crippling equity returns and dividend payments can make the energy too expensive, and the tribes are denied ownership and control. That's why these Sioux tribes joined together to form a multi-tribal public power authority and issue bonds. Anyone can buy bonds. It's a safe investment, and the interest paid back is reasonable. Also, full ownership of the wind turbines and other assets remain with the Sioux Nation. As a bonus, the lower cost of bond financing means that these Native American tribes don't need tax credits for the project to work. Some wind projects are at the mercy of production tax credits and therefore the whims of Congress, but the Multi-Tribal Power Authority doesn't need them. While the world is getting hotter, reliance on fossil fuels isn't going down. More than ever, people must think about the long-term effects on their children and their children's children. When future generations look at what we built, what will they see? Pipelines or turbines? By uniting, going big, and issuing bonds, the Sioux tribes can deliver sustainable wind energy far and wide and to more communities, build political clout, and run a world-class operation. Please join us by pledging your support at siouxwind.org.
Traditional indigenous farmers are also teaching better ways to build sustainable farming to withstand climate change, and this solution is ancient Native American farming techniques.
This is your problem with food security. I hope you are all familiar with this problem. I don't know where the meal I ate today came from, but the average meal travels 1,546 miles or so between point of origin and point of consumption, right? Not to mention those kiwis from New Zealand and the shrimp we're getting from China. The problem is that that's where your food is coming from, one. Two, what is the intersection between that and peak oil? The higher the price of oil, the harder it is to transport that food. Plus, all that food is very petroleum intensive, right? They're saying that it takes up to 10 calories of fossil fuels to produce 1 calorie of food at this point in our industrial agricultural system. Is that sustainable over the long haul? Probably not, right? So this and the issue of who owns the seeds is the second part of our challenge. This is our work. This is my friend Ivan Curry. He's holding you asked me, this is a Lakota squash. Someone was asking, you guys were asking me about what my seeds look like. This is what our seeds look like. Okay, these are Lakota squash. These are cool looking dudes, man. They are, I don't know, they're probably about 500, 600 years old. And we started trying to grow these out. And then this is Bear Island flint corn. I had this much of it from a plant scientist in Iowa from a seed bank. I have acres of it now, right? What do I like about this corn? This corn grows to be about that tall. It's a hominy corn. You all know what hominy is, or pasoli, right? So it's a soup corn. You eat it all year round, not just like sweet corn, right? The corn is this long, this tall, and it has big ears. Now, what is interesting about this? You ever seen this up against a Roundup Ready field of corn? Roundup Ready corn, you know, these other corn varieties are much taller. What happens in a wind sear, right? The big guys knock over. These little guys are all still standing. It's very interesting. These seeds are pre-industrial. They are not accustomed to fertilizers. They don't need a couple dustings of Roundup, and they don't need irrigation. Now, in a time of climate change, what's got its best shot? You understand what I'm saying about this? These guys and the micro varieties that have been created historically that are heritage seeds are biodiversity. And if the Irish potato famine taught us anything, it's that what you want is diversity, not a monocrop. The challenge that we now face is the growing out of these from boutique levels so that you can just get it, you know, a little bit there. You know, there's some people I was visiting with earlier, they grow enough food for a family of 4. You know, most of us don't grow that much food. But the question is how you grow enough food so that your communities, when faced with rising food insecurity in the times ahead, will have it. Our suggestion is these local foods.
Also, we have a big potential in food. and I'm talking about organic food, because there's a difference. I don't know how is the debate here in the U.S. about the transgenic or organic, but in Bolivia it's a very strong debate. We believe that the organic food should be paid much better than the non-organic food, and Bolivia produces, basically organic foods.
February 24th, the day that Russia began its military operations in Ukraine, I think will be remembered for many reasons, and I think one is that it's a sign that the West is in decay. And as the war in Ukraine kind of drags on, and there's this kind of push for more NATO aggression and expansion, we kind of inch closer and closer to nuclear war. And this idea of kind of a European centrism. But I think what at the heart of it, it's like, it is, this is a European civil war that they're trying to drag the rest of the world into. And raising kind of the level of nuclear warfare puts not only Europe in danger, but the rest of the planet in danger. But it also has done this, it has, been a gift to many of these, so-called like humanitarian groups who want to ignore U.S. wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the bombing of African countries, the continued U.S.-backed war in Yemen that's led by Saudi Arabia, who's using U.S. weapons to essentially kill hundreds of thousands of people, the U.S. intervention in Syria that led to the deaths of over 500,000 and the displacement of millions of others. And so I think, like, from an indigenous perspective, we can look at the diplomacy of the United States as being one of only a hammer, right? And if all you have is a hammer, then everything is going to look like a nail. And I think it really does, if we look at the context of Ukraine and the way that the United States fueled this ethno-nationalism, and, I think Onye brought up a really good point about this kind of post-Soviet era where, it's not to say that the Soviet Union was this kind of like utopic place, but nonetheless, it was a balance between different ethnicities in that country where like plurality could exist and flourish. Whereas, when the United States intervened in 2014 and helped topple the government, it was like they were trying to implement a homogenous, Ukrainian nationalist idea, which didn't allow for what we would promote as plurinationalism. So I think this idea that indigenous people or colonized people the world over should be supporting this quote unquote decolonization attempt on behalf of Ukraine completely ignores how this is really just European a chauvinism at the end of the day. And
Cornel West has that higher consciousness thought on point, and with that, he has the solutions to help de-escalate the possibility of World War III and build bridges to better human relations.
It's great to have you with us. Can you talk about why you've decided to run for President of the United States?
Well, first, Sister Amy, I want to salute you. You are an exemplar of longevity, of integrity, and consistency. And we go back many, many decades. So I just want to always begin on that note. You're putting a smile on Brother George and Sister Dorothy's face, your precious parents. But no, my announcement of running for President of the United States to be head of the empire to help dismantle it in such a way that poor and working people would be at the very center, at the very core of our vision of what a good society actually is. That it has to do, as you can imagine, with these very bleak times, these very desperate times. So it's a kind of act of desperation. I'm 70 years old. I've been at this for 55 years, and I have a calling that flows out of the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and Edward Said and Chief Joseph and Dorothy Day and Grace Lee Boggs and Louisa Marino. All of those are the best of America. And I think we're at such a low point that America needs to be reintroduced to its best. And its best has always been the movements for justice, the struggles for freedom, the solidarity based on a fundamental commitment to the dignity of those Sly Stone calls everyday people. And there's no doubt in my mind that the two-party system now is a major impediment for the empowerment of poor and working people. I'm thoroughly convinced that, of course, the neo-fascist Republican Party has already made it very clear that they're tied to big business and big military, big tech and so forth. And the milquetoast neoliberal Democratic Party strikes me as being incapable of taking seriously the fundamental needs of poor and working people, not just here, but around the world. The militarism abroad, $7 billion frozen for the brothers and sisters in Afghanistan, and what's been AFRICOM in Africa, and what's been going on in the Middle East. Thank God that you keep track of the precious Palestinian brothers and sisters and all the hell that they're catching. You have it every day, and I thank God that you do. Why? Because Palestinian peoples deserve to have a visibility in terms of their suffering and ways in which they can attempt to get out from under. Same would be true, of course, for our Jewish brothers and sisters in Russia or in a France where their rights are being violated. We're wrestling with organized greed. We're wrestling with institutionalized hatred. We saw that with our precious gay brothers and lesbian sisters and queer siblings in the earlier report. But it's also a matter of routinized indifference. There's an indifference to the plight of the vulnerable. More and more, it's becoming not just a fad and a fashion, it's becoming a normalized way of life. And that is what leads toward wholesale fascism, not just here, but in other parts of the world. And we've seen it, of course, in Hungary. You see it. We saw it in Brazil. We can go on and on in this regard. So for me, it's really a matter of trying to be consistent with what I've been about for the last 55 years.
Cornel, you talk about militarism. I want to ask you about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In March of last year, you told The New Yorker, "We must try to stop the war, recognizing that the American empire has little or no moral authority when it comes to violation of international law and the overthrow of national sovereignty, as in Latin America, the Middle East, and Asia." You've also called Putin, you've been severely critical of President Putin for the invasion. Talk about your views on what happened, what is happening, and how the war needs to end.
Well, one, I think you have the clash of two empires. The Russian Empire is a deeply wounded empire. It's had its territory cut back. Of course, its economy is shrinking. And then you've got the American Empire, which is the most powerful empire in the history of the world. In fact, it's the 68th empire out of the 70, going back to the beginning of the human species. And so on the one hand, you have the promise of the American Empire to the elites in the Russian Empire: we will not move an inch. And within decades, 14 of the satellite countries of the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, are part of NATO. There's missiles right on the borders and boundaries of the Russian Empire. Now, we know empires behave like empires. I mean, if there's missiles in Canada and Mexico, the U.S. government would blow them to smithereens quick. We saw it in Cuba in 1962. So that empires behave like empires. They're greedy. They're driven by predatory capitalist dispositions. They're obsessed with hierarchy. They're concerned with domination and conquest. The Alexander the Great, associated with a grand empire. So that in that regard, there's no doubt in my mind that the expansion of NATO has played a crucial role in the wounded Russian Empire, with all of its repression, all of its regimentation. Let us never forget about the thousands of Russian brothers and sisters who are going to jail in opposition to gangster Putin's criminal invasion. But he's pushed against the wall and he responds. That's how heads of empire respond. So we've got to be in solidarity with the suffering of Ukrainian brothers and sisters, but we have to recognize NATO is an instrument of American imperial foreign policy. We've seen it over and over again, and so we're witnessing a proxy war. There must be a ceasefire. There must be a stopping of that war. Why? We're on the road to nuclear war. That's the last thing we want to see, my dear sister.
And as president, what exactly would you do to stop that war?
Oh, one is I would pull back on the U.S. military support. I would sit down with the elites from the Chinese empire, given all of their forms of regimentation and repression in their own context. Think about our precious Muslim brothers and sisters in China, the Uyghurs. But I would sit down with the Chinese. I would sit down with the Ukrainians. I would sit down with the Russians and say, we're going to stop this war, and we're going to come up with a plan, a process with a variety of voices heard to make sure that the suffering stops and we understand and we're honest about the larger context of the war. And unfortunately, we just don't get this kind of perspective, in corporate media. Thank God for democracy now, and thank God for a few other venues to try to tell the truth about this. Because my dear sister Amy, that I'm a jazz man in American politics, and jazz is about blues, and blues is about catastrophe, lyrically expressed and candidly confronted and artistically transfigured. And the catastrophes have to be wrestled with. It can be ecological ones. It could be economic ones of grotesque wealth inequality. It can be social ones, political ones, psychic ones. And then there is swing, which is a different conception of time. So we have ways of authorizing a better future given what seem to be all of the closed roots, all of the foreclosures, all of the alternatives trumped. So you have to make sure that the vitality and energy that you have swings in such a way that you never lose hope in having solidarity with oppressed people around the world. And of course, the third element is improvisation. And improvisation is about what? Well, it's not just an artistic skill. The Ron Carter's geniuses like that still alive remind us. It's also a form of practical wisdom. As freedom fighters, we got to be improvisational. We got to be flexible. We got to be fluid. We got to be protean. We got to learn how to listen. We can't be dogmatic. We can't be ossified. We can't be petrified in how we look at the world. And right now, we have to have presidential debates and politics in which people who look at the world through the lens of what the great Frantz Fanon called the wretched of the earth.
Cornel
Poor
West.
people and working people, no matter what color, gender, sexual orientation, national identity, or region.